The Dark Legacy of Richard, a criminological case study. Murder is a word that echoes within the depths of the human psyche. It invokes fear, sorrow, and revulsion toward the darkest reaches of human capability. In the quiet city of Killeen, Texas, in 2004, the name Richard Lee Tabler would come to embody this darkness, leaving behind a trail of death and terror that still chills those who dare to recall his story. Richard Lee Tabler was not a household name, nor did he have the background of infamy often attributed to the notorious serial killers of history. He wasn't the neighbor that everyone knew, the charming professional who hid his demons behind a polished exterior. Tabler's crimes, however, placed him squarely in the crosshairs of law enforcement and the collective horror of a community. His story is one of calculated ruthlessness, a chilling detachment from the value of human life, and a stark reminder of how the consequences of one man's choices can ripple far beyond the surface. In November 2004, the town of Killeen was rocked by a string of cold-blooded executions that seemed to come out of nowhere. Quinceanera DJ Mohammed Amin Ramouni and his friend Haitham Zayed, two young men seen as staples of the local entertainment scene, were gunned down in a crime that left investigators searching for answers. Two others would later lose their lives at Tabler's hands, including an exotic dancer and her confidant, killed in what authorities uncovered as a grotesque quest for dominance and vengeance. The murders were not spontaneous crimes of passion. They were, as prosecutors later outlined, meticulously planned and executed by Tabler, asserting control and inspiring fear among his victims right up to their final moments. His own descriptions of the killings during his confession were gut-wrenching, recounted with painstaking detail that left no question as to his culpability. He even went so far as to suggest his commitment to delivering death efficiently, clinical, methodical, and utterly without remorse. Tabler's arrest came not as the result of an exhaustive manhunt, but through the gradual unraveling of his web of self-delusion. Boasting to acquaintances and showing disregard for the inevitability of justice, Tabler not only incriminated himself, but also implicated his accomplices. His obsession with control was mirrored in his belief that he was untouchable, as if the violence he orchestrated placed him above ordinary human constraints. Once in custody, the evidence against him began mounting rapidly: ballistics, cell phone records, and the testimony of those implicated alongside him. His trial became a grim recounting of his crimes while simultaneously exposing the calculated mind behind his actions. Tabler manipulated, orchestrated, and meticulously pursued the deaths of his victims, leaving no ambiguity about his guilt. The jury sentenced him to death in 2007. Friends and families of the victims watched as justice was served, but were left only with the cold comfort that the executioner might one day carry out the sentence. For many, Richard Lee Tabler's sentencing should have marked the end of his chapter. But for death row inmates like Tabler, time between sentencing and execution is anything but brief. Here on death row in Texas, he found space to continue spreading fear, creating controversies that would reach beyond the walls of his tiny cell. In 2008, reports surfaced that Tabler had smuggled a cell phone into prison, a contraband object that, in his hands, became a weapon more potent than many could have anticipated. Using the phone, Tabler made more than 90 calls, taunting and terrorizing members of the Texas legislature. In one of the most chilling twists of the story, he even contacted the families of his victims, threatening them from the graveyard of justice where he was supposed to languish. The revelation demonstrated that Tabler would wield whatever tools he could command to exert his terrifying presence, even from the confines of death row. His threats forced law enforcement, correctional institutions, and the justice system at large to confront a glaring loophole in prison security. How could a convicted killer extend his reach from the most restricted of environments? Understanding motives is a core facet of criminology, and Tabler's actions provide a disturbing portal into the psyche of a man consumed by narcissism, control, and pathological need for recognition. Tabler's willingness to recount his crimes without hesitation during interviews demonstrated detached confidence, almost prideful in the wake of his atrocities. Experts who examined him suggested patterns consistent with psychopathy, an absence of empathy, an extraordinary egocentrism, and a lack of remorse despite the gravity of his actions. Tabler admitted to the murders without hesitation and, even while awaiting his death sentence, shifted focus from atonement to amplifying his infamy. His behavior exemplifies traits found in some of history's most dangerous criminals, challenging the notion of rehabilitation and reform. If Tabler is to be evaluated as anything, it is within the framework of pathology, an individual seemingly beyond the reach of morality and redemption. The smuggled phone incident caused a ripple effect across Texas prisons, shining a harsh light on systemic failures deeply buried under layers of complacency. How could Tabler, convicted of such heinous acts, obtain and use a device that allowed him to inflict additional terror on innocent people? In response, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice launched a widespread crackdown on contraband within their facilities. Prison searches increased, accountability tightened, and protocols were revised as the public demanded answers. Politicians who had received death threats from Tabler used their platform to advocate for stricter oversight of correctional practices. Yet questions remained. Could such reckless oversights be mitigated entirely, or would Tabler's actions become one of many cautionary tales in the underestimated world of contraband smuggling within prisons? His case became a benchmark for discussions on reform, but at what cost? Tabler's crimes and subsequent sentencing became fodder for the ever-prevalent debate surrounding the death penalty in the United States. Supporters of capital punishment utilized his name as evidence that some people posed too significant a threat to remain alive, even incarcerated. Tabler's apparent lack of remorse fed into the belief that his execution was not just warranted, it was necessary for justice. However, voices of dissent questioned whether Tabler's execution would truly bring closure. How would further state-sanctioned killing reflect on a society that sought to uphold justice and humanity? The financial and emotional toll of appeals, carceration, and delayed executions brought long-existing concerns about the death penalty into sharper focus. Tabler's name, whether intended or not, became one of the many puzzle pieces in a far broader discourse on morality versus consequence in justice systems worldwide. For all the attention given to Richard Lee Tabler and his actions, the true victims of his story are the people whose lives were torn apart by his cruelty. Victims like Mohammed Amin Ramouni and Haytham Zayed, young men stripped of futures they would never see. Families left grappling with grief that no verdict or sentence can ever truly heal. Tabler's self-serving actions on death row continued to rob them of peace, with threatening calls reopening wounds for people desperately seeking to move on. For criminologists and true crime enthusiasts alike, it is a sobering reminder that beyond every killer's infamy are lives stolen and families forever changed by their deeds. Richard Lee Tabler's case is more than just a headline for true crime buffs or another statistic in criminological studies. It provides a lens through which we can observe the very nature of criminal behavior, justice, and the ripple effects of brutality. His path from a small-town murderer to an inmate wielding terror from behind bars exposes systemic flaws, both in human nature and in structures designed to contain it. His actions have fueled debates that tap into society's deepest moral and ethical questions. Do people like Richard Lee Tabler deserve redemption, or are they simply beyond saving? Can justice, both punitive and restorative, ever truly balance the weight of their crimes? More than anything, Tabler's life story serves as a chilling reminder that crime does not end when the perpetrator is caught. The scars left behind, on the community, the families of victims, and even on the integrity of justice systems themselves, run deep. In the shadows cast by people like Richard Lee Tabler, we find the unresolved dilemmas of our modern world. His name lives on not simply as the man who killed, but as a symbol of gaps in reform, unresolved debates about punishment, and the depths to which human actions can sink when stripped of empathy or restraint. As we peer into these shadows, one must ask, does watching lives like Tabler's unfold offer us a blueprint for prevention, or merely a dark reflection of human failure? For the true crime enthusiasts and the criminologists sifting through stories like his, perhaps the answer lies not in the events themselves, but in the questions they force us to confront. And so the case of Richard Lee Tabler remains, etched into the annals of true crime, a haunting lesson in the intricacies of crime, punishment, and the human condition.